Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 6th of August and today we're going to talk about the Zherebets front and about the oil tanker that was hit by the Ukrainian naval drone and about Russian airstrikes. Let's begin by looking at the situation to the northeast of Kupyansk because the Russians are steadily advancing to the south of Vilshana and Pershotravnove. They have advanced, you could say at most 1 to 2 kilometers over the past couple of days in this area. In essence, what's going on over here is that the Russians are trying to expand their sphere of control to the south of these towns like Vilshana and Pershotravnove, where you have these open fields and ditches that are not really occupied by the Ukrainians. The main Ukrainian formations in this area are around towns like Petropavlivka and Sinkivka, so they don't have that many resources in the fields and ditches that are to the east in the area that I'm marking with these blue squares. So this is an area where perhaps the Russians could advance and take over new positions that are on a ridge that overlook the Oskil River Valley and all of its crossings. Let's actually look at the topographic map. So I'm sorry because all the town names, they're written in they're not written in English, so it's hard to tell which it's referring to. But here you can see this Kupyansk. The front line spanning from Vilshana to Pershotravnove generally runs like this. And you can see that the Russians are pushing in the direction of these ridges over here. This is a higher elevated area, open fields, not many towns in this area. You don't have many strong Ukrainian fortifications. And so the Russian goal would be to push in that direction, take it over. And then from there, they would have these very good positions to overlook the Ukrainian positions in Kupyansk, not just in Kupyansk even, but also in its suburbs where they also have a lot of fortifications where they're currently trying to defend in the forested areas along the front line and, as we said before, in Petropavlivka. And then also to the south of Kupyansk, you have various other towns that are nodes for Ukrainian defense and for basically the Ukrainian forces that are crossing over the river. And so it's going to be harder for them to cross over the river and bring in new equipment and to even hold a line across the river as Russia tries to get closer to these ridges that are overlooking the Oskil River Valley. But again, the main goal I would say for now is just to shape the battlefield in a way that will allow Russia to advance even more in the future. So for now, this isn't anything that significant. It's just a localized attack. And speaking of Russian attacks, we need to talk about Novoselivske. So the news about Russia taking over Novoselivske came yesterday on the 5th of August. I was a bit cautious to talk about it, so I waited until today in the morning to talk about it, but we had confirmation from Russian MOD that they took it, but again, you can't really trust anything they say. You can't trust any MOD during a war, or really ever. But the Russian MOD, from my experience, talking about the war and talking about the front line, usually they announce the capture of towns a bit after it's spread around the Russian Telegram channels. Because when I say Russian sources, I don't usually mean like Russian official government sources. I usually mean these pro-Russia sources, either from outside of Russia or from inside Russia with, maybe some connections to the governments. But you can't just take that one report as gospel and say that's enough to say that Novoselivske is under Russian control. But then you have more mainstream Russian sources like Rybar reporting on it, and they're also pretty cautious, I would say. Obviously, not always. They've had mistakes in the past. But then you had the deep state map today in the morning. I was checking. They updated the map, and now they're indicating that Russia is in control of most of the town. So there is a bit of a discrepancy because deep state says that the front line looks a bit like this, where the last 2 blocks are still in this gray zone, and that Ukraine has still these positions on the western outskirts of the town over here. But either way, they have the capacity to acknowledge that Russia has advanced over the past 24 hours from their previous line, which is pretty close to the rail line over here, you could see. And so based on all this information and also based on some footage I'm going to show you, it does seem likely that Russia took over Novoselivske. And the way that this happened, based on the timeline and the previous videos we've made over the past week, is that the Russians, they attacked from 2 different directions. Most of the Russian emphasis was put on the southern flank around some of these forest plantations. And the reason why Ukraine defended it so heavily is because if Russia were to take them over, which they've taken over part of these hedgerows, it would give them perfect positions on heights to overlook Novoselivske, but not just Novoselivske, but also Stelmakivka. Stelmakivka is a local Ukrainian defensive node. There's a lot of Ukrainian forces and artillery batteries or maybe not artillery batteries, but mortar batteries, you could say, that are stationed in this area. And it is an area that you have coordination with troops before they get moved closer to the front line and fighting in the fields. So it is a very important forward position for the Ukrainians, but it is unfortunately for the Ukrainians on a valley. And there is a massive discrepancy between the elevation there versus the heights that Russia was fighting over to the south of Novoselivske. And so the Ukrainians diverted a lot of resources to defending in the sector. And that's part of why they were able to hold the line for that long. But then at the same time, the Russians, they moved in some of their reconnaissance forces with support from infantry fighting vehicles and tanks across the rail line and began occupying positions just to the west of the rail line and the local bush line that you could see over here that I'm marking in red. So that's how it started. They were trying to split up the Ukrainian defenses, and this was not the only place where Russia was attacking along the Svatove line. So you did have the Ukrainian forces spreading out. The Ukrainians do have depth in this area, but it is hard to respond to every single attack at the same time when you had Russian attacks on Kremina, on Torske, on the Zherebets Bridghead, on Kupyansk, on northeast of Kupyansk, like we talked about. That did certainly spread out the Ukrainian forces to a certain extent, which did allow the Russians to have a bit of an advantage as they moved through the town of Novoselivske. Also, the Russians did pound the town very heavily. Novoselivske is on relatively high ground, especially compared to Kupyansk, which is the main Russian node of attack, you could say, in this area. So that's a disadvantage for the Russians, but despite that fact, the Russians do still have the artillery advantage in this area, and they were firing very heavily onto the town itself. And because the Ukrainians really didn't have any cover, you could say they had some cover in the remains of the houses, but the houses were so flattened after really months of fighting, maybe a year of fighting by now, that there's not a lot of area for a large amount of forces to take cover. And that's also part of why Ukraine was eventually forced to withdraw, because they were just suffering a lot of casualties in this killing zone. And I have just one example here of a video that was released by RIA Novosti, a Russian media, showing the Russians shelling the Ukrainian infantry groups as they tried to enter Novoselivske. This is something that happened pretty recently, you could say maybe 2 days ago. What happened is that the Ukrainians, for a while, had not been in full control of Novoselivske. Really, for the past month, Novoselivske, in the area that I'm marking in blue, has been a gray zone. The Ukrainians really only had control over the western warehouses. So they were trying to re-solidify control over those warehouses in order to prevent further Russian advances into the town. So what happened was you had this small group of Ukrainian infantry in BTRs that was entering the town and trying to go into one of these warehouses that is partially destroyed. And in the process, they suffered very heavy casualties. The Russians were shelling them. They didn't have much cover. They were trying to hide behind BTRs that were previously destroyed in the fighting months ago. And in the video, there were 6 Ukrainian troops that were killed. So that's just a microcosm of what's going on a larger scale throughout the entire front in Novoselivske for a couple of weeks now. And that's part of why the Russians have now been able to take it over. So in terms of the future, the Russians are going to continue, and they are at the moment fighting on the southern flank, trying to really consolidate control of the heights overlooking Stelmakivka. And then from there, you could say that their goal long-term would be to take over the town, and that would allow them to knock out a key Ukrainian fort position. And then there's also some reports of fighting to the north of Novoselivske, but to a much lesser extent. The goal there would be to take over Brestove, where you have a lot of these Ukrainian forces being sent to fight in Novoselivske. So the retreat of the Ukrainians was probably to that town. And so let's move on to the Zherebets Bridghead now, where the line hasn't changed at all. What we're hearing is that the Ukrainians are attacking on the southern part of the bridgehead, not as much around Krasnohorivka or Nadia, where, again, there has not been much clarification over the front line. I still see so many conflicting reports from all sides in multiple directions. I would say generally the consensus is that Krasnohorivka and Nadia are around the front line, and then there's a dispute as to whether it's contested or not. But what we're seeing today is that the Ukrainians have been attacking near Krasnohorivka, and this is the town that the Russians use as a focal point of their attacks across the river. A lot of the Russian forces that cross over the river, they cross through here, and they establish positions on this buffer zone around some of these forested areas. And the Ukrainians, they're trying to hit at the core of the Russian attack by advancing in this direction. And so they sent their forces to basically dislodge the Russians from this area. But the Russian 21st Motor Rifle Brigade was able to hold the line, and the situation is the same as it was previously. Now, moving to the south, there's one last change of the front line that must be noted, and that is around the town of Krasnohorivka. You see here, I've added in more of a gray zone around Krasnohorivka because before the map, it was very binary, and that's just not reflective of what's going on over here. This part of the front line is the most fortified part of the front line, you could say. I guess the argument would be that maybe Zaporozhye defensive lines are akin to the fortifications over here, but the ones over here in the Donetsk axis have been built up over 9 years. So a lot of these areas, these fields in between the fortifications and the trenches are not occupied by either side. It would be sort of suicide to set up a position in some of these areas because it's just a totally open place. There's no patches to hide it in some of these places like this field over here. And so neither side controls it. But the Russians did actually expand their sphere of control a bit. They advanced a couple hundred meters, you could say. And they were able to take over this key trench over here. So this trench that you can even see on Google Maps, it's controlled previously by the Ukrainians, and it was used as a forward position to prevent Russian advances through the fields around this rail line and some of these bush lines. So the Russians, they have released footage which was geolocated to this trench line, which shows the Russian mechanized infantry aided by BMPs entering the trenches and clearing out the Ukrainian defenders. So this is just one step in entering Krasnohorivka. The Russians previously took over this local fortress. I think this is a mine shaft, if I'm not mistaken. And this means that the Russians are now in a position where they are, let's look at the measuring actually, at closest about 700 meters or at most about 1 kilometer away from the town itself. But again, entering the town is going to be a very arduous process, and it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to require a lot of artillery fixing and destruction of Ukrainian positions and very local advances through field after field, trench after trench. And then after months of that process, you might see an entrance into the town. Now let's talk about the Ukrainian strike on a Russian oil tanker. What happened was that on the night of August 4th, you had the Ukrainian SBU in conjunction with the Navy. It hit this Russian oil tanker called the SIG. This was done by an unmanned surface vehicle that was carrying 450 kilograms of explosives. The strike, it created this hole in the ship's engine room around the waterline of the ship. And it was done on the starboard side of the ship, which is on the right side. If you're sitting forward looking at the horizon, and then the left side would be the port side. In the starboard side, and there was some flooding due to the hole that was created. Eventually, the 11-man crew was able to stop the flooding, and the ship is still afloat. We don't know we don't know the full extent of the damage and whether there were casualties. Ukraine says there was, and Russia says there wasn't. And we don't know whether it was carrying oil at the time. The Russians say it wasn't, and the Ukrainians say it was. But either way, there was no major spillover, so we don't really see any oil leaking into the water itself, which is good news. The Ukrainians hitting the engine compartment probably meant that it was less likely to cause an oil spill, but it also means that it's going to be more expensive for the Russians to repair, and it caused more significant damage. So what is the significance of this ship? Well, this tanker, the Americans sanctioned it because it was sending oil to Syria. And this was done both for civilian purposes, for the civilian economy over there, but also to fuel the Russian military. And also, presumably, it is sending fuel to help the Russian war effort in Ukraine. And so this is a blow to Russian logistics because this strike happened very near to the Kerch Strait. So this is the third time in the past week that a Ukrainian naval drone has been able to hit a target that is really in Russia's backyard, very close to the heartland of Russia, near its own sphere of influence in the waters of the Black Sea Fleet. So you had previously the Novoselivske being hit, you had the Kerch Bridge being hit, and now again near the Kerch Strait, another strike by these drones. So now the Ukrainians are saying that all of these ports along the Black Sea that the Russia is using to basically help them out militarily and economically, they are under threat, and that the Ukrainians, they reserve the right to hit it, and that they will continue hitting these ports until the Russians, as they stop utilizing the Black Sea Fleet for these military purposes. What this means is that basically every single part of the Black Sea that Russia has naval assets in is within the scope of danger and that it could be hit in the future, which could disrupt the supply of cargo to the front line. You have these landing ships that are being hit. We had the incident in Novoselivske. Now it's going to be harder to transport equipment and men through these ships. It's going to be harder to transport oil, as we said with oil tanker. It's also going to be harder to use these ships that are used to launch these different cruise missiles into Ukraine, because Russia likes sending in the Black Sea Fleet into the heart of the Black Sea to launch these strikes onto Ukrainian territory. So now all of that's going to be much more difficult, and there's also going to be numerous supply issues that are caused as a result. And this is pretty interesting because Ukraine doesn't really have a navy of its own, so it's just relying on these naval drones to do so, which is a cheaper option than having an entire navy that could also be susceptible to significant damage. So in a way, this is a very interesting and innovative way of responding to the lack of a navy that Ukraine has. This was done in conjunction probably with the British and with NATO more generally. And we don't know where these drones are being launched from. We don't know if they're being launched from the coast of Odessa. If they are, then that's just crazy, because that would mean that it's going 700 kilometers undetected, hitting Russian targets very close to the land of Russia itself. If they're being launched within Russia from Crimea or, maybe from Krasnodar or something, then that is also pretty significant, because it means that the Ukrainians are entering Russian territory and causing havoc from within. But either way, it does create the same effect to the Russian logistics. Now, speaking of the Black Sea, the Russians, they did launch a series of airstrikes, and they also launched strikes from the Black Sea Fleet itself into Ukraine. They launched these Caliber cruise missiles. There were, I believe, 15 Tu-95 bombers airborne above Ukraine that launched several strikes. There were also ballistic missiles that were launched from Belarus, not by the Belarusian military, but by the Russians, which again shows that the Russians do have military assets in Belarus. Basically, every single oblast was targeted, and there were explosions in multiple different oblasts, sirens everywhere, except for Odessa, I believe. And there was some significant damage, especially to the Khmelnytsky area, and specifically to this airfield near the town of Starokostiantiniv. So this is the airfield. It's been hit multiple times by the Russians already. And what's interesting is that yesterday, when these strikes were occurring and also going into today in the early morning, this specific airfield was hit 3 times. There were 3 different waves that hit it. And this was done because the Soviets, when they were in control of this airfield, they constructed these massive concrete barriers that they used to protect the aircraft that was stationed in the airfield. And so it's very difficult for airstrikes to knock out these concrete barriers and actually destroy the many different aircraft in the area. So there's 40 different concrete barriers that were built up, and they're also spread out across the entire airfield. So that would minimize the damage that was caused on a broader scale. Now, at the moment, the Ukrainians are using this airfield as a base for the Su-24s that they have remaining. And those Su-24s are equipped with Storm Shadow missiles, which is explaining why the Russians are going after it so hard. And so that's really all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. And just like and subscribe. Join the Telegram, by the way. I just made a new Telegram account. Follow my Twitter, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.